Good afternoon. This is Gma in Bennington, America. Gma again. And I want to talk to you all about, as the title said, the ethics of unity, stamping out division. And then that will entail and include speaking of the Demiurge, explaining what that is, and some more talk about Jesus. So, I want to pick up where I left off last week, ultimately dealing with the scripture synagogue of Satan. And we talked about terms and meaning of those terms last week, but that's where I want to pick it up. Some of these topics I deal with today may seem divisive, and as you know, that's not my intent to be divisive. The intent is to, as the title says, to achieve unity and to recognize that it is that makes a positive impact. But I have to deal with these topics because of the division and the anti-Semitism and the things going on in our culture, in our towns, states, nation, world. We need to understand where some of this has stemmed from, and I've talked about other reasons before, and these are reasons you may not be expecting. There's Sophie Sagai, she is a Jewish author, and she is on Facebook, and she states that some of what I told you last week, that the Hebrew meaning of the word Satan means adversary. And it's not the same as the Christian use of the word as a devil. We see the Christian Bible calling some Jews anti-God as if they were followers of the Christian mythical devil. This is anti-Semitic, and indeed these passages in the Christian Bible have been used as an excuse to murder Jews for 2,000 years. And that is why the teaching today. The echoes of my heart are for unity and positive impact that comes from that unity. So let's go with what is a demiurge, because I did not know. And if any of you want to know more, study more, research more, feel free. Justin Sledge is a really good teacher. Demiurge, let me spell it, Demiurge. The concept of the demiurge, according to Plato, is a divine craftsman who organizes the cosmos out of pre-existing chaos, and that the building the builder builds can only be as good as the chaotic rotten wood he has to build it. For example, if the builder is building a home out of good wood, then it's going to be a fantastic home. But he's saying that the demiurge is this divine craftsman that took this rotten wood to build a building, and so the building can only be as good as the wood is. So therefore it's not good, is essentially what he's saying. And so the idea that Plato has of this demiurge also needs to be understood in the concept that he still did not think that the demiurge was evil at all. And so keep that in mind as we continue. There was a Gnostic demiurge, however, and that transformed Plato's demiurge into an outright evil being who claimed to be the only God. This demiurge was often identified with the Old Testament Yahweh, and I'm using the name Yahweh because of the fact that Justin, who was teaching this, was using that pronunciation, that way of saying it, and he explains why. And I'm also doing it because a lot of people understand when I talk about that. When I talk about that name. So the Demiurge was often identified with the Old Testament Yahweh. And one of the things that you need to understand before I go any farther is, if you'll remember, I've done a video and a teaching on Yahweh and how a god from a pantheon of gods became the God of Israel. So that's kind of where I'm at on this, and that is where this teaching is coming from. And so this Demiurge was often identified with the Old Testament Yahweh. And the idea that Yahweh traps human souls in this physical world, keeping them from the higher true God. So Egyptians actually combined their chaotic storm god Seth with Yahweh. And eventually, he became a donkey-headed demon. And that was shocking to me. I thought, oh my gosh. I did not know that. This was their response, apparently, to the picture that was painted when Yahweh delivered the Israelites from Egypt. So, the idea of Pharaoh's drowning by this god, this demiurge, was offensive to them. So the association between the demiurge and Satan, the Christian being, developed later on from this idea. And this was due to Christian and occult reinterpretations, and the fact that a lot of times Christians were ending up in Egypt during certain periods of time. So you have the Gnostics who believed that the God of the Old Testament, as the Demiurge, was a false deity who enslaved humanity through law and materiality. Now, enter the character Jesus, who became deified despite his dying. So Christianity enters, and we think of them as having unity early on, and at least I did, and Justin was pointing out that they did not have this unity as to what they believed and what their beliefs were. It wasn't that there was Christianity, it was there were Christianities, plural. And the reason for that is because they did agree upon certain things, that Jesus came, Jesus died. He came, he taught, he died, and he was resurrected. So they had like that framework, but as far as the details represented, it was like that's where the Christianities plural came from, the different beliefs that were all being influenced by even at that time philosophers and others. And they also agreed that the deity had to be good to be divine. So, enter in history Marcion, Marcion. And he was a Christian, and he rejected Yahweh entirely in favor of Jesus's God. This, and maybe even, he might have meant even in favor of Jesus as God. I think that's what, I may have written that down wrong. And you'll understand why I said that here in a little while. So this idea reinforced the idea that the demiurge is a deceiver, a role similar to Satan. And so when I say that, I say it as Satan, as the devil in Christianity, that being, not the Hebraic term for adversary, Satan. So the Marcion idea was that the Demiurge is a deceiver, a role similar to the Christian being Satan. Okay? Marcion believed that since the Demiurge was not good, he was not a deity. And so, you had a lot of Christians that were living in a time where the Hebrew Bible was used and read, and so it was kind of like, okay, what do we do with this? Because Marcion is saying, okay, if this God of the Hebrew Bible was not good, he was not a deity. So it's kind of like you read the Hebrew Bible and have to determine, Marcion read the Bible and determined that Yahweh was not a deity. And he played a role in the first Christian Bible, apparently. And so he develops a Christian canon, but of course he excludes the Hebrew Bible. And he develops like another text and then a third text called I kept wanting to say antithesis. Antithesis is the title of it, for his followers. Well, apparently, Justin said that there are only fragments of this text, and so they're trying just to go by the fragments of that third text. And he said, keep in mind that Marcion was Greek, he's not Jewish, and so it does make sense that he wouldn't include the Hebrew Bible. And then you have the fact that they're in a time period where, as far as Catholicism, Christianity, it's a time period where there were no such thing as the Pope decreeing something, and it was. And so I thought it was interesting because apparently this antithesis contains a sort of version of Luke, maybe an early version of Luke, and some letters of Paul, and so that is what this is called. And basically what he does, this is Marcion, he takes Jesus as an example in Luke and begins to contrast Jesus, who he believes is good, therefore he's God, with Yahweh of the Hebrew Bible that he believes does bad and therefore is not God. So essentially he's saying Jesus is good because he does good, and God does bad, so he is bad and he's not God. And so he begins to present this moral opposition. There's not even any connection whatsoever. It is this moral opposition, and one of the best examples that I know we hear over and over is that the Torah has instructions, an eye for an eye. Jesus, of course, we know, turned the other cheek. Many, and I see this still today, and it's like even I, being raised Christian, like I can see how some of this crept in, and there were some of these things I didn't like or understand, and why that was a part of what we supposedly believed. So I think it's interesting because I do think that many still see things the way that Marcion did. They don't identify Yahweh with Jesus. It's you see over and over people praying in Jesus' name, and Yahweh just kind of ends up out of the picture. And then you have examples like where Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. So it's almost like there is some deception there, because if you look at, and of course, I have to keep in mind, and I want you all to keep in mind, so much of what Jesus supposedly said, and I've said it over and over again, was written years after Jesus died. And so we have no first-person account of what he believed and what he said. We only have second and third person accounts and quotes from what Jesus supposedly said. So I find it interesting that, Marcion presents him as good, hello, and yet you see at the same time the places where he said, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. So it's like you begin to think, now wait, what? And then the times when he would tell his followers, if you love your father and your mother, then you don't love me. And that's one of the ones I taught on even last year that I really have a problem with. And so the idea that Marcion is presenting him as good, and yet you see all of these extreme things that he supposedly said, you're kind of like, how is it that he's good and so therefore he is God? Because that's what's being presented in contrast to the God of the Old Testament. And if you look at it, Jesus was not liberal at all. He was very conservative. He, especially where halakha, the Jewish law, was concerned. One of the examples is where the Samaritan woman, he tells her something and she's like, but there are crumbs, even I can eat the crumbs, and so then he's like, eat the crumbs. And he just goes on from there. So it's interesting that, and I know I'm a prime example of that. For so many years, I just read certain scriptures and read them in certain contexts. I never went front cover to front cover of the book, the Bible, that included the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And so I say all of that to say it's so interesting when any of us actually read the Bible and not trying to justify any God, but you're just looking at it as literature and you're saying, and even I did, and I know for me it was hard to figure Yahweh out. And I know that a lot of you know where I'm at on that, but that's not necessarily the point here. Marcion said that there were two gods, okay? He said a wrathful God who can't be God because he's not good. And then you can tell, and I thought it was interesting when Justin was pointing this out, because I've talked to y'all about this before, how it seems like Paul made Jesus the leader of Christianity. And so I thought it was interesting because as Justin kept teaching, he said you can tell in Paul's letters that Marcion did believe that Yahweh created the world, in that sense that he's in control, but so he calls Yahweh the world ruler over and over again. That's what he calls him. And you get that when Paul says, you get it when Paul is saying things and talking about the ruler of this world. And so from Paul is where you're getting that. And the Christians teach, and I know this because that was what I was taught when I was a Christian, teach that the ruler of this world is the devil. But that is not what Marcion was teaching, and that was not what he was saying. He was saying that the one who made the world is in charge of it, and that's not Christ. And so what he was trying to do was to undermine that deity. He did not want Yahweh to be God, and he could be creator, but he could not be God, okay, because he wasn't good. And so Marcion's Demiurge was responsible for creation, but not a God. And keep in mind, Marcion was a Christian. And he saw Jesus as God. Marcionic churches lasted for centuries. They would just tell you they were Christian. They didn't say where Marcionic Christians were Christians. And so they lasted for centuries. And most people today, like I said, and I remember the times when I've believed some of this and I'm going, this is where this came from? You know, but you're taught it's the authoritative word of the Creator. Most people today, low-key, think that Marcion is correct. They may not say that, but essentially that's what those beliefs entail. That's what those thoughts entail. Now, if you look at the Hebrew book, the Hebrew manuscript of Matthew that I've talked about before, it is very Jewish. And it presents Jesus as not coming to abolish Torah, and actually encourages the rabbis of the time, the scribes and the Pharisees, to sit in the seat of Moses, which would have been referring to the 10 words, Aseret HaDibrot, and or what you may refer to as the 10 Commandments. And I do also. But what he was encouraging was for them to sit in the seat of Moses, sit in the seat of the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, and stop adding to and taking away from those. Now, let's contrast that with the book of Luke. It's interesting because Marcion rejected the Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. And it's probably because it was so Hebraic, so Jewish. And so we know that he did because there is a lot of what Marcion believed in the book of Luke. And so what he did was, with Luke, he made everything a bit nicer, okay? It's less Jewish. And Jewish anti-Semitism can be somewhat attributed to Marcion, or at least his beliefs, because what he begins to do in Luke is he presents the idea that the Jews are conspiring to kill Jesus, who was Jewish. So you have this Hebrew manuscript of Matthew presenting him as a Jew and part of the Jewish people, only having a problem with the scribes and Pharisees, who he feels like are adding to the instruction that Moses gave. And so now you get to Luke, and he presents the idea that the Jews as a whole are conspiring to kill Jesus, who was a Jew. So you have what's happening here is what I'm talking about. You see this in the writing. You see his beliefs begin to take hold, that the evil Demiurge, the creator of the Old Testament, is now this manipulator, and he's manipulating his own people, the Jews, to kill God, Jesus, because that's what he believed. So we go over here to the myth that he was trying to speak about the Jews as a corporate entity now at this point. In other words, he is presenting Christianity, and that's why I call it a myth, because I'm just like, whatever. So he presents Christianity and says that it supersedes Judaism, as well as is opposed to Judaism. So he's saying that Judaism is a religion of law and death that follows this God of law and death. And so that being cannot be God, and he is opposing that, creating this dualism with Jesus leading life and love. So that is pioneered by Marcion. If you go to John 8:44, you find Jesus, who is a Jew, arguing with Jews, saying they don't have the same father. And the Jews are saying, what are you talking about? Abraham is our father just like he's your father. And Jesus told them they belonged to their father, the devil. That is an idea that came from Marcion. That is not a mistranslation. The end result of long argument, you go to the book of Mark, and Jesus is arguing with, as we said earlier, just the scribes and Pharisees over adding to and taking away from those 10 words. All the way now to where he's basically a Jew himself in the book of John, arguing with all Jews, having this theological debate between him and their God that Marcion considers the bad guy. So John is asserting from this Marcion idea that the Jews have the devil as their father. And in the Greek, if you go to the Greek, according to Justin, it's actually saying your father is the father of the devil, or you belong to the father of the devil. Basically, the devil's father. So, that, do you see now the link to anti-Semitism and coming from these Christian sources? You've got 6 different Christian groups documented that some of these early Christians considered Jews having the devil as their father. And they also, there were Christians, this is documented as well, that the devil had a father, devil has a creator, and the origin of the devil, and stating that the world is not good and is bad. And this is why the world became hostile, interestingly enough, to Christians at the time. You look at now and it's like widely accepted, and it's like, sounds okay. It's presented in ways that have become accepted, I guess is the best way to say that. Basically saying they gave the answer that the world is bad because Yahweh, the Creator, is bad. So if he made the devil, he's bad. And so John is essentially saying, you Jews are of this evil Demiurge, this evil creator, Yahweh. And yet, this is why I don't do gods at all. because I heard all of this and it just spoke so loud and clear to me, because I knew what I had talked to y'all about that was on my heart last week, and I found myself going, aha, this is where the anti-Semitism comes in. And this is where the division still comes in, and we have to stamp it out. It can no longer be, your God is better than my God, and my God is better than yours, and your God is bad, and mine is good. These ideas are coming from people trying to do, as I talked about last week, trying to understand. Trying not only to understand the Hebrew Bible, but just trying to understand life in general, and understanding the common sense that says we exist, there has to be a reason. And I do believe, as I've shared with you before, we do have a creator, but I do believe that our creator is eternal, and there isn't any necessary reason for all of this other nonsense. And I just think that we have to be so careful of what we are saying, what we are doing, what we are believing. Do we know why we believe what we believe and where those ideas come from? I was shocked to find, I wasn't shocked in that, like I told you, I've read front cover to back cover and got to the New Testament. It was just like, this is so anti-Jewish and so anti God's people, and I was like, it's anti-Semitic, and I don't like it, and I don't want any part of it. Now I'm beginning to understand why. And so we have to be so careful that we are understanding terms like Demiurge, understanding who Jesus was, the truth, and I know it's going to be very difficult to know an absolute truth where he is, because we don't have anything that he said, as I said, firsthand. And so these were supposed followers, and yet we're finding out Marcion, if you notice, was even creating a different Jesus than what's in the Hebrew manuscript of Matthew. So we have to be careful, and we have to be careful that we are not considering Jews the synagogue of Satan, murdering them, and having all of these anti-Semitic ideas. And just because Marcion presents Jesus as being this God who said all of these things, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I would encourage you to really follow through with this, study this, and consider this. But I just want to go back to what Sophie said in the beginning, that this is where we have to be very careful, that we begin to see that the Christian Bible is calling some Jews anti-God as if they were followers of the Christian mythical devil. And that excuse is being used to murder Jews and to hate them, and to, whether you realize it or not, actually have this diabolical, like, separation from them, like they're evil, and you can't even associate with them. And now, don't get me wrong, there are many who do follow the idea, okay, they're the chosen people, and we're to bless Israel, so we can be blessed. I get that. But I'm just saying, look at where we are right now, and I think we have to really get honest and find out, why are we here? And then say to ourselves, do I want to be there? Or do I want to be unified? We have a good creator. We have an eternal creator. A creator, that's why I leave all the God names out and all the hullabaloo, if you will. I leave all of that out, and I say we all have a creator. Can we not just get to what unifies us and stamp out that division? I love you all, and I encourage you to please study and find Emmet. Mwah. Have a great week. It's not letting me get to where I'm finished. There we go. I'm done now. Maybe.